So you are watching this because you want to learn a little more about the artist Tony Albert. Psst, maybe write some stuff down. To fully understand Tony Albert and his artwork, we need to go way back to a time before Tony Albert was even a glimmer in his parents' eyes. Handing it over to you guys.
Aboriginal people have lived in Australia for at least 50,000 years.
Before European settlement, there were over 500 Indigenous nations in Australia.
In the 1800s through the 1970s, the Australian public believed that Indigenous children were disadvantaged in their own communities.
The stolen generation is a term that describes the Indigenous children that were removed from their families by the government.
Here are some facts about Aboriginal people today.
There are 670,000 people that are Indigenous Australians,
and are 14 times more likely to be locked up in prison.
Only 3% of Aboriginal people complete a university degree,
and the life expectancy is 10 years less than non-Indigenous Australians.
Organisations such as Career Trackers and AIM are determined to create better futures for Indigenous youth.
In 2008, a campaign for Indigenous health equality was established. The Close the Gap campaign shows that significant improvements in the health, education and employment outcomes for Aboriginal people can be achieved before 2030.
Film, art, music and dance is a vital part of Aboriginal culture.
These are all different ways for Aboriginal people to tell Dreamtime stories.
Movies with Aboriginal content were rare before 1995.
Now there is over 10 movies made each year with Aboriginal content in them.
Plus a free-to-air National Indigenous Television channel.
Art, it is an important part of conserving Aboriginal history. Traditional Aboriginal art dates back at least 30,000 years.
Music and dance has always been a part of Aboriginal culture. Aboriginal people traditionally imitate animals when dancing to the sound of a didgeridoo at ceremonies.
There are many Aboriginal people who are famous for a variety of reasons, such as sport, music and acting.
Tony Albert is an Aboriginal Australian. Obviously, Albert's heritage has impacted his upbringing and life. Knowing that those political and historical events affect all Aboriginal people, it becomes obvious that Albert is going to be influenced and thus create artworks about those occurrences.
This work, Sorry, by Tony Albert. Tony is an important contemporary artist from Brisbane who also happens to be Aboriginal. And a lot of his work revolves around representations of Aboriginal people and particularly what those representations have been in the past. So these are actually a number of works from his collection of kitsch or Aboriginalia. Originally we sort of started looking at things on eBay. You pick up little trinkets like this on eBay. Everybody's had sort of one or two of these things in their house, and a lot of them end up on eBay or in the markets or somewhere like that. And Tony's been collecting these Aboriginal faces in particular for almost a decade, or I think his whole life in reality, but very heavily over the past decade. A lot of these faces are produced by white companies, and they appeal to a mainstream sensibility of what Aboriginal people are, or something that they can keep from Aboriginal culture, when in reality they're almost completely manufactured. And through Tony's work, he's sort of bringing a lot of those individuals, black faces stuck in a white world, if you will, back together and giving them sort of a group is also bringing them back to some sort of Aboriginal sensibility by collecting them, being in the collection in the presence of an Aboriginal person, and then reinterpreting them through some of these text pieces in particular that he's making. This particular work, Sorry, was commissioned by the gallery for the exhibition in 2008. Optimism. It's a very optimistic work looking at Kevin Rudd's apology in 2008.
For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry. To the mothers and the fathers, the brothers and the sisters, for the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry. And for the indignity and degradation thus inflicted on a proud people and a proud culture, we say sorry.
Apology in 2008 to Aboriginal people, particularly to people who were removed from families and adversely affected by the policies of the Australian government over the years. And of course, the word sorry is a word that he said many times throughout that speech. Now, the figures in this relate a lot to a lot of those people as well who were affected by those policies, often cut off from Aboriginal families, Aboriginal culture, cut off from who they were. So in a way, the kitsch objects as well, which were manufactured and were these sort of things that were meant to be Aboriginal that were sort of floating around, and I guess they've all been brought back together by this very important word and gesture. But in the end, what you have is a big word on the wall. And I guess at this stage, that apology is still really a word and a gesture, and we're still waiting to actually see what comes out or what will be the future ramifications of that apology and the gestures of goodwill.
It was the morning of the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's apology. Was this truly to be a significant moment in our history? I crept into Arthur's bedroom and gently woke him. We went down to the lounge room and turned on the television. I was surprised at how the event stirred up a lot of emotions for me. I thought about my family and my old people, my grandfather who was taken away from his mother and separated from his brothers and sisters. I turned and looked at Arthur. I was reminded of all the stories he had told me, stories of his home, stories of his life, and stories from Arakoon. I knew that every piece of Aboriginal legislation had impacted on him directly. I looked at Arthur's face. The scars across his cheeks read like timelines through his life. I turned all my thoughts to my dear old friend. We sat quietly for some time. What do you think? I asked. Arthur replied that I've had a lot of things happen to me in my lifetime, but I can accept that apology. And I was left silent. It has now been 2 years since Arthur and I watched the apology together. Since then, I've made a great deal of work that directly references the event, such as this large wall-based text work, seen in 21st century, and a huge collaborative piece with Arthur currently housed overseas. The project involves each of us working on separate canvases, creating our own work, but with the intent that they sit together. Side by side, the paintings talk together and have a conversation. From an old man from Wick Country talking to a young man from the North Queensland rainforest. We mark a moment entwined by our histories together. I have seen a lot of change over the past 2 years. Well, I haven't seen a lot of change over the past 2 years. Sorry remains just a word. What made that day special was sharing the moment with Arthur. It was his actions that really made a difference in my life. And I will miss my dear friend.
Summary. Kevin Rudd's apology in 2008 impacted Albert. Albert created Sorry, 2010, as a commissioned work for an art gallery in Brisbane. Albert's grandfather was a part of the stolen generation. Sorry is just a word. Albert makes it clear that Rudd's apology has changed nothing. It was and is just a word. It is easy to see how all of these things impact Tony Albert's artistic practice. Tony Albert's childhood has had a huge impact on his artistic practice. Let's hear him talk about that.
The work behind me is called A Collected History, and it comes from a collection of objects that I've been collecting since I was a child. I came from quite a modest family where we would buy a lot of our clothing and goods from second-hand shops, and I came across these objects with Aboriginal faces on them, which, for me was so amazing, seeing images of people that looked like my family and people that I could identify with on this ephemera was very, very exciting. So I started to collect as a child, and I guess as I grew up and became more aware of the social and political undertones attached to this kind of work, and it actually became, I guess, the foundation of my art practice. So when working on a piece like Collected History, I kind of had the scale planned out, the 2.5 metre high by 6 metre long, and how I'd work in my studio is that I would draw up that scale on the wall and slowly start to introduce objects to it daily, just through, hammering works, nails into the wall. And through that process, I actually worked on top of some of the items, so making marks on them, and it also includes some of my own painting. So there's this real collaborative cohesion that's going on between all the pieces and who I am also as an artist. So the alien for me is the representation of the other, or something from another world or another planet. And I'm also very interested in the way in which alien is used as a term to reference Aboriginal people, in saying that they were alienated or they are alien, when the terminology alien means anything foreign. So it's actually impossible for something that's indigenous to a country to be alien within its the confines of where it exists. So it's very metaphorical, I guess, the use of alien. I have a love for that kind of paraphernalia, so there's kind of a fun element attached to the alien as well. It's an ongoing symbol I use in all my work.
A summary of A Collected History. Albert grew up in a modest family who often shopped at second-hand stores. Albert has collected Aboriginalia since he was a child and now uses it within his artworks. The trinkets sparked familiarity for Albert. They were faces he could recognise. Aboriginalia has a political and social implications, as it is often made by white people but represents Aboriginal people and their heritage. What is meant by the term alien? It means something foreign to the place. As a term, it is impossible to use it for Aboriginal people. Despite this, Albert likes to use it playfully within his artworks. Let's learn a little about Tony Albert and his audience.
Well, the project I'm doing for the art fair is called Be Deadly, which is a commissioned project through the art fair, which I thought about what I wanted to be and do here. And this is my third year being involved, and what I do love about the Cairns Art Fair is that the presence of the community here, and my artwork, what I wanted to do was produce something that could be easily accessible to the community and readily available, and through that I thought of a poster as a good idea for the actual artwork itself. Well, the premise behind the poster as a positive and kind of enriching statement for children to hang in their rooms, but the actual artwork within itself is that the posters are $10 for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and $20 for everyone else. So it's looking at this idea that equality exists through the acceptance of difference and not through things actually being the same. So this is a new body of work where I'm looking kind of philanthropically in a way at ways in which I can use my art to help or support other people. So regardless of the price variation in the posters, 100% of the money goes towards a mail out to all communities, schools and art centres throughout Queensland, and my hope is that I could represent this project in other art fairs both nationally and internationally to provide some kind of forum or way of expressing these issues that I'm talking about, but making it accessible to everyone.
Be Deadly was a work commissioned by the Art Centre. It has heavy community involvement, and it is accessible art in a poster format. Equality exists through the acceptance of difference, not through things actually being the same. Let's look at a local example of Tony Albert's artwork.
Hi, my name is Tony Albert, and I'm here at my exhibition titled Brothers at Sullivan and Strumpf Gallery in Sydney. This story came about during a visit to Sydney. I actually came down to Art Space for a 6-month residency. At that time, previously in Brisbane, where I was living and working, I was looking at some cases of police violence and brutality that happened on Palm Island in far north Queensland. And I was interested when I was down here, a case that happened only just around the corner from Art Space, where some young joyriders were shot by policemen, and the kind of aftermath that was attached to that shooting as well, and working with some young Aboriginal boys on what is titled Brothers exhibition. So not long after the incident, there was a protest rally at Town Hall in Sydney, and having been quite an active member in the Brisbane community in terms of social and political attributes to daily life, I went along to that protest with some friends of mine in Sydney. And one of the interesting things that came out of it from being there was a group of the boys' friends that had turned up, and during the rally actually took their shirts off and they had drawn targets on their body, which was really fascinating to me, that kind of political defiance that they had, but also the use of the target, which had been in quite a lot of artwork, not only by myself, but kind of peers and contemporaries of mine were using the target as kind of this contemporary symbol of day-to-day life, and interesting or I guess problematic things that had come out of the social and political papers and government of that time, like the Northern Territory intervention, which kind of labelled Aboriginal men without, I guess, a conviction or naming anyone, just put a blank statement across Aboriginal men as women bashers and pedophiles and those sort of things. So it came out of like this idea that we're constantly wearing a target as people, but I guess with this optimistic twist that though we're wearing that target, how and why and where and when can we wear it or change it, and that's kind of where these photographs stem from. So in the lead up to the work Brothers, I was asked by a curator to work with Aboriginal boys' school out at the Shire called Kirinari, which is kind of like a boarding house where children across, or young men across kind of rural New South Wales coming to Sydney for school, so it offers them a place to stay. Breakfast, lunch and dinner is kind of provided. They have a house mum, a house dad. So that relationship was struck up, which was kind of really fortuitous at the time, that I was really interested in having these young men portray their target images. And there was 18 boys there in total, so we went through this kind of process together where I spoke about my feelings and ideas about the event and spoke to them about it. It became a very collaborative kind of partnership. And I was very honest at the start that the way in which my photographic practice works, that we might take hundreds and hundreds of frames, but maybe only 5 photos will get used, or 10 photos. But subsequently through the process and the Brothers show, we ended up using all the boys in the show, which was something really fantastic for me and for them, because it was, in the end, I feel, a very collaborative kind of protest, kind of work. But 3 ended up being large-scale photos as well, representing our past, our present, and our future. So that was something that was kind of interesting that came out of it.
The work Brothers was influenced by an event in New South Wales where some Aboriginal joyriders were shot by the police. This led to a protest that Albert attended at Town Hall in Sydney. He saw Aboriginal people wearing targets on their bodies at the protest. Brothers is based on the violence and brutality of labels and stereotypes. Tony Albert worked with boys from a Sydney school to make this work. Now let's view one of Tony Albert's most recent works.
So the work is called Once Upon a Time, and it's based kind of on a narrative itself, hence the title. The call out for the prize itself kind of coincided with the incident of Adam Goodes in the Indigenous round. Sport and the Australian psyche with sport gives us an opportunity to really reach an audience that not necessarily coming into art galleries, and that's something that really interests me as an artist. Quite often we're preaching to the converted within an art crowd, and it's how do we get all members of Australia to walk into galleries and actually to look at different works and be challenged and have conversation about these broad range of topics. For a piece like this, I would make up to 40, 50 things and then go, well, I've got these to work with. What formation is going to work the best? Instead of just looking at 26 individual works, you can look at it as a whole piece as well. This is a Christmas card from around the 1920s, but very iconic in this way of, well, how did we get to this idea where Aboriginal people are referred to as apes? Aboriginal people were still considered flora and fauna up to the referendum in the late 60s. And that's this idea of the coin and that we've got the Queen's head on all our currency and the other side all our native animals. And the $2 coin has, the Aboriginal person. So every day we deal in a currency which is putting Aboriginal people in the position of flora and fauna. I'm a collector of all these kind of objects. This is how a whole generation of people grew up with this kind of ephemera. But it's actually really important cultural material of how we established ourselves as a country.
A summary of Once Upon a Time. Tony Albert was ready to pitch his work to a new audience, sport lovers. Albert represents Aboriginal people as apes, as they were considered under the Flora and Fauna Act until very recently in our history. Albert uses the $2 coin as a metaphor for the perception of Aboriginal people in Australia, again referencing the flora and fauna. Time for our final summary. It is clear that Albert considers his audience when making his artworks. It is also obvious that he is impacted by his Aboriginal heritage and the historical events surrounding this. Albert has set out on a mission to change the stereotypes of Aboriginal people held by non-Aboriginal people in and out of Australia. I hope you wrote notes. A video made by Miss Alicia Summers with her Year 10 art class in mind.